Good evening and welcome to Information Please, your Peoria Public Library on the air, bringing information about your library and your community. And this evening is the start of a two-part show of a very special guest who's here all the way from Virginia. Happens to be my daughter, Kelsey Noack, who is the assistant curator for the lab at Jamestown Rediscovery at Jamestown, Virginia. Hi, Kelsey.
Hello.
Obviously, you're home for the holiday, but I commandeered you and brought you here because we're also fascinated about the work that you do. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like hometown girl makes good on the East Coast. But I really think that people here in the Midwest would really, really like to hear more about everything that's going on at Jamestown, considering you just had the 400th anniversary. Mm-hmm. You met Prince Philip.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, and every day you hold in your hands the earliest part of this country's history, which I think for our library users and the rest of the community is really interesting to hear about. So back up a little bit, and people a lot of times think of Jamestown, they think of the Disney movie Pocahontas. We have the New World movie that came out that not a lot of people saw. I don't think it was more of an art movie. But could you tell us a little bit, just about, set the stage for us, tell us the true facts, the true story about Jamestown?
Well, Jamestown was founded as pretty much just a commercial venture, and there was the Roanoke settlement in the 1580s, and that was unsuccessful. And a lot of the knowledge that they gathered on that attempt was put into use to settle Jamestown. And so they knew a little bit about what the natives were like, and they knew that somewhere on the East Coast they could probably find things like gold that were going to bring a lot of money back to England. And so what happened is that several of the men who owned the Muscovy Trading Company in the East Indies, so they were making money by moving things around, they decided to start the Virginia Company of London. And they actually decided to take a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of money and just send them over to Virginia and see what they could find to bring back to England to create income. So it was a commercial venture to start with.
Basically, which is somewhat in contrast. We don't get all sentimental like we do about the Pilgrims, right, because it's not this, heartfelt bid for freedom kind of thing. Right. It's just pure money making. So maybe that's a little bit of why so much of the lore of Plymouth Rock and all that has been woven into our history, and not so much Jamestown.
Right.
But still, an incredibly important building block for our country, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay, so who actually came when they sent that trading company over here?
They rounded up all of the people who had invested money in the company, and they had 104 men and boys, plus sailors, to man the 3 ships. They actually rented ships from themselves, sort of like renting a U-Haul van. They rented them from their other company, so they're taking money out of one pocket to put it in the other, and they took all of their leftover goods, ceramics and things like that, armor, sort of secondhand things, and they took all this stuff and they just sort of got in these ships and came over. And so you had a lot of gentlemen who had invested money, and they were the ones who had the military training and the administrative training to run things. And then you had a lot of laborers who had specialized trades, people like goldsmiths, not necessarily farmers and fishermen, and there were no women on the first voyage. So they weren't coming to Virginia to sort of set up house. They sent a bunch of people to do specific jobs to make money. And one of them was Edward Moriah Wingfield. He was the first president or governor, and then you had just various gentlemen, including Captain Bartholomew Gosnold, who had also come across on earlier trips to look farther up the coast.
So this wasn't the first trip for some of these people then?
No, actually a few of them had already been to North America and knew what they were looking for. There are also people, of course, like John Smith, who were used to being soldiers and going out, traveling all over and meeting, different cultures and, being given a job to go do it and then come back. So this was sort of like being deployed overseas.
There's one thing that I think people in our culture today just don't understand. Why would they have taken boys with them? What did the boys do?
The boys were good to have because they're sort of filling in the space where you need somebody to go up in the rigging, or to go someplace that an adult man couldn't go. They were also good for making contact with the natives. Actually, one of their boys, who I think was about 9 years old, was traded to the natives so that he could learn their language, and then he could come back and he could be a translator for the English. So the boys are there to sort of fill in the gaps, help out the men. When they needed an assistant of some sort. And these would have been boys who didn't have a family and they have to work to support themselves. So they signed up for this job to come to Jamestown just like the other men did.
So this was in an era when you didn't have the local orphanage or the welfare society, so a child on their own, this was one of their options. Were there any children of gentlemen who were sent as, like they did in the Navy, where they put them in the Navy very, very early so that they could be trained to be an officer, almost like going to a special school?
Not that I know of. I don't think any of the 4 boys that were sent over were, really apprenticed to anything in particular at that point.
Okay. Well, I think everybody knows about, that the things were bad at Jamestown eventually, but what happened when they very first landed? What they had a plan of what they wanted to do. What did they actually do?
Well, part of the problem was that they had intended to leave London in December of 1606, and because of bad weather, they were actually stuck for about a month sitting. So it's sort of like you're going to go on vacation, you've got the whole family and all of your stuff loaded in the car, and then there's a problem with the car, but instead of letting people get back out of the car, you make them sit there because any minute the wind could change and you could be able to take off. So they start off with a month's worth of deficit in supplies, and they get to Virginia a month late. So it's a little too late to plant crops by the time they get there. They've also exhausted all their food and water. They did manage to stop in the Caribbean on the way, but they weren't really, basically they get to Virginia and they have no food or water. They're wearing clothing for England in December, and it's May in Virginia, which is already very hot and humid, and it's too late to plant crops. And the first natives that they encounter when they get there attack them. So they just go up the river. They were instructed to go pretty far up, and they went all the way up to almost where Richmond is today, and then they turned back around to come to Jamestown. They were supposed to be somewhere where wasn't inhabited, and someplace that was a good defensive position, and they did that. They found the perfect defensive location, actually, and then they proceeded to build the fort and establish contact with the natives, and immediately set to work looking for gold and all sorts of valuable things. They tried everything from glass manufacture to fishing, things like that. How
long did it take them to build that first fort?
Well, they actually didn't foresee a need for building any sort of protective barrier at all, but they were worried about the Spanish, and so within I think a matter of weeks they had this wooden palisade built. It's pretty rough. It's just timbers split in half and then set into the ground and all sort of nailed together with a piece at the top.
Not much really defense against anything,
no.
Just slow you down a little bit.
Exactly. They were mainly concerned about the Spanish coming upriver, and so they were able to build these 2 bulwarks on the corners, and so they had defensive positions, gun platforms, sort of like a tower on a castle.
Okay, for those who may not be as familiar with history, what were the weapons in use at that time? What would the Spanish have had? What did the English have? You mentioned armor, so we're still wearing armor.
Right. You're going to see the big, the breastplates and the cabesset helmets, sort of what we think of the all the conquistadors wearing that sort of armor. And like I said, they were using sort of secondhand, nobody was using those. They're big, heavy pieces. And they were using matchlocks for their personal arms. So you've got a gun that basically you have to have a piece of rope that you keep lit all the time, and you have to keep that from dragging on the ground or in the water, and of course you're in a swampy area, so that's sort of difficult to do, and you've got to keep powder and lead shot loaded into the gun at all times. And there was a rule about if you were on sentry duty, you had to have one shot in your weapon, and then one you had to keep a lead ball in your mouth, and so that you'd be ready to fire at any time. We actually find lead shot with tooth marks in it occasionally. So we've got guys standing around on sentry duty, waiting for the Spanish who never come. And they've got
and getting lead poisoning because they have a lead ball in their teeth.
Then you would also have a variety of larger artillery, mainly sort of I think falconets and smaller, not the giant cannons that people usually think of as smaller guns, but it's all going to be, big pieces of lead or iron fired out of a long tube, powered by gunpowder. So it's pretty basic weapons.
Basic, and yeah, I think a lot of times people aren't real sure, unless this is something they study all the time, people aren't real sure what would have been there or what would have gone on. But of course we have plenty of books at the library. If this catches your interest, we can get you all kinds of information on everything from timelines to illustrated military photos to everything that you could possibly need to be able to picture exactly what went on there.
Right.
Okay, so give me just a brief thing of how long were they sort of in desperate straits before it actually became more of a permanent settlement? If you can give me a little outline of the early history.
Well, they arrived in May of 1607, and because of their sort of bad luck in general, there was a drought. They're experiencing a 7-year drought. They're right in the middle of it. They're also in the middle of a cold period, so you've got all the biological systems in the tidewater are thrown off. So everything from water salinity to animal behavior, all those things are different. And the natives there too are experiencing stress because of dietary reasons and things like that. So it sort of builds up, and then by the winter of 1609, 1610, that's the starving time, and that's what everybody thinks of. Where everybody's dying and you're just burying people left and right, and they actually lost quite a few people their first winter there too. So the winter of 1607, 1608 was bad, but the winter of 1609, 1610 was worse. And so you just sort of had this gradual decline over the first 2 or 3 years, and then in 1610. And 11, you see a big revival. Lord De La Warr shows up. Some of the ships that were supposed to have come to resupply were wrecked in Bermuda in 1609, and they actually had to live there for a year before they could build their shipwreck into 2 smaller ships and come up to Jamestown.
And that's an interesting story because that inspired something very famous that everybody should know about. What is that?
Shakespeare's The Tempest.
Right.
Probably a lot of the guys who knew people at Jamestown were friends with Shakespeare back in London, and so he may have been inspired to write The Tempest based on that shipwreck in Bermuda, which the 400th anniversary of that's going to be next year in 2009.
Okay. Yeah, I think, I never knew that until you landed out there that the Tempest was inspired by wrecked settlers who were supposed to be headed for Jamestown. But it's interesting too because all this have actual hardcore proof because you actually have ballast stones that came from Bermuda. Yeah,
we do. Actually, there was a well that we found a couple years ago out at the site because the chimney base from the governor's house had sunk in, and the governor's house had cobbles and things. Bermuda limestone was built into the foundations of that house, and so we know that it has to be after 1610 that house was built because those materials wouldn't have been there before then. And so we know that the well underneath has to be earlier than that because they built the chimney for the house on top of it. So
on top of it.
That's sort of how we figure out the dates for things.
Well, I mentioned before this is going to be a 2-part show, and we're going to talk about the background of Jamestown today, and then we're going to talk about archaeology of Jamestown next week, and so that we can have plenty of time to get into all this in depth. But okay, so they had actually started to leave, right, and abandoned like their armor and a lot of things.
Yeah, and that was actually exciting. The queen, when she came to visit, the archaeologists were out in the field working for her. So then, as she walked up, they started uncovering all these things, and they found armor and swords and things like that. So it looks like it looks like the cache of armor that we read in the documents, that they were getting ready to leave and they probably didn't want to carry all this big heavy armor back with them, so they decided to just bury it there inside the fort, and then they left. And so we probably found, that's what that's probably from, is when they were abandoning Jamestown. And they actually packed everybody up and got ready to go, and they were headed down the river. And then Lord Delaware starts coming upriver with his people, and he says, "What are you doing?" And they say, "We're leaving. It's, everybody's starving, everybody's dying, the natives are attacking us." And he says, "Everybody turn around and go back." And so then they all have to turn around and go back up to Jamestown, and they go back to the fort, and that's a huge rebuilding period. You see a transition in the architecture in the very early years. They start rebuilding things into brick instead of just the mud buildings, mud and stud, which are, wooden with a plaster wall. And so you see a lot of building going on right at that time period. So,
and these are all the kinds of things that you find there at the site now.
Right.
As you can see the different layers of the mud and stud, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Mud and stud buildings, and then the brick buildings and the Bermuda limestone, and all this is all there.
Right there in the ground. Yep.
Yeah, which is a fascinating puzzle. And I know that a lot of people say that Jamestown is like, the nirvana of archaeology, because every spadeful of dirt turns things up, because it was neglected for so very long and just not disturbed. I think people too don't realize how long Jamestown went on and all the other things that went on there. I think people think Jamestown was there and then it was gone. And can you kind of summarize a little bit of some of the other things that happened and how long that was actually a town?
Sure. So James Fort was established in 1607. By 1624, there were enough people and enough things going on there that they really outgrew that triangular fort that they built. It was only about 100 by 140 yards by another 100 yards. So it was a pretty small area to have 100 guys living for several years. And so they expanded out into Newtown. So after 1624, we call that the end of the fort period. And that's when we start looking at the rest of the island being used. A lot of it is a swampy area, and so not good for farming. And so of course people spread out into the surrounding areas, but Jamestown was still the main port area. That's where all the ships came into. There's a very deep channel, so it's a good place to bring the ships. And so Newtown spreads out, and actually Jamestown being the first site of representative democracy in the English system in North America. They were meeting in the church, and they decided to build a state house. And so they started building, I think, in the 1660s, this state house. So it's the first governmental building in Virginia. And they continue to expand that building. It's burned once during Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s.
Can you explain Bacon's Rebellion a little bit?
Well, a short summary of it would be that Bacon wanted to continue to expand into the frontier, and he didn't care about encroaching on native territory. And word from England was, stop at this line, don't go any farther. And he said, that's ridiculous, and sort of gathered up some followers, and they went around attacking, the English who were loyal to that command, and also the natives. And so he sort of made two enemies at once and didn't last very long. So, he was sort of quashed pretty quickly. And so then they rebuild the State House after it's burned. And then they continue to add on to it over about a 30-year period. And it burns a second time in 1699, 98 or 99. And in 1699 they decide, instead of rebuilding here in this place that we've outgrown where there's not a good supply of fresh water, why don't we move up to Middle Plantation, which is now Williamsburg. And so they moved the State House, and after that everybody went with the capital, really, and Jamestown just sort of became farmland and was pretty much abandoned.
Yeah, it became like many small towns do when whatever the central thing is and people move away and it all just empties out, and so Jamestown just kind of became like a ghost town, right, or parts of farms, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so you got about 90 years where that is, the center of English activity in North America, and then all of a sudden it moves, up to Williamsburg, and there's just nothing there. And so there's a church that was there built in the later part of the 17th century, and so everybody knew that that's where Jamestown had been. But and then the whole church falls down except for the tower, and so it's very picturesque. There are a lot of paintings and things, very romantic, of these ruins of the church tower, right. And cows wandering around, and this sort of sandy beach leading down to the river. And then in 1861, the Confederate Army decided that was a good location for a fort, because it's still a good defensive location. And they come in and they actually scoop up part of the dirt from the 17th century layers, and some other, they just sort of make a huge mound. It's about 8 or 9 feet deep of dirt right on top of James Fort, and then they build a wooden deck on top of it, and they use that as a gun platform because they're worried about the Union coming up the river, the same way the English were worried about the Spanish. And they never see any action there. So they actually do use the guns on the platform there to test iron-sided ships in the river. But the men weren't living, on this platform. They were living in a farmhouse or something. And so we don't have any Civil War period materials right there. So what that did was it preserved James Fort underneath without anybody knowing, because you have this very visible 19th century structure on top of it.
Which fortunately didn't have much of value
right.
in it.
In terms of materials, yeah.
In terms of material
right.
in it, yeah. Well, let's look at, you brought us some pictures
mm-hmm.
too, so if we could have the first image, mm-hmm. and you'll have to look carefully because there's quite a bit on this. Here's your first image, and can you tell us what all is on here?
Right. So our project is the Jamestown Rediscovery Archaeological Project, and there's a map there in the top, I guess it's the top left corner, Virginia, and so we're right there on the coast. There are a series of tidal rivers. Island is on the James River, and you can see in the bottom right there's a map of Jamestown Island, and that red arrow is pointing at our property. So we have just a portion, I think it's 22 acres of the island, belongs to the organization I work for as a nonprofit. The rest of the island is owned by the Park Service, so we co-administer the park there with them, but we own the property where the fort is. And then I've got 2 portraits there, John Smith and Pocahontas, who are probably the most famous people to come out of Jamestown.
All right. Well, if we could have the next image then. That's us. There we are.
So then here we have an archaeological map of the fort site, and so you can see there those 3 sides that I was talking about. And each one of those corners, the bulwarks would have had a wooden platform for putting artillery. The one that's farther inland in the top of the map there, you would actually have somebody with a smaller with a matchlock patrolling for natives probably. So there's sort of a brown looking structure in the middle of the wall on the right side. And that's the church. That's still, the tower is still standing today. The body of it's been reconstructed. So that's something very visible. If you do visit, you can see. And then the other things that are outlined in red there, we've got the 3 walls of the fort, and then several structures that we found inside. And there's sort of a blue rectangle in the middle of that map, and that is a 1670s, probably dates to the 1670s structure that we've been working on this year. And then you can see on the top of the screen there's 2 images just from the field, people working. One of them is an excavation of the well that I spoke about, and the other is just a general view of field work, so you can see what it looks like if you do get a chance to go out.
And you're in that. You're at the top of the picture doing field work, and down below is the gentleman who had the faith to believe the fort was still there.
Yeah, Dr. Bill Kelso, who was convinced that something had to be left because he had gone out there when he was younger, and he always asked what happened to the fort, and they would always tell him it had been washed away into the river, but fortunately there's quite a bit of it left, and so he did some testing in 1994 and was able to find it.
Okay.
Foundations.
Well, real quick, let's get our next image. Mm-hmm. These are all artifacts.
That's right. These are some of the things that we've found recently. Of course, once we're done with the field work, we have to go into the lab. That's me in the bottom there with all those boxes working on some artifacts. There's some things, the other image with all those things set out on the table, those are all iron objects that have been conserved. There's a sword in the middle there that's going to be going to the Smithsonian soon, part of an exhibit temporarily that we're going to have up there. Up in the top right corner, there's a picture of some conservation being done on a breastplate. There's a gold ring with a skull on it. That is a Memento Mori ring, and we found that this summer, actually. It's got the initials of Christopher Lawn on it, and so that was a really neat find. We also find glass beads and things that were used in trade with the natives. And then in the center screen on the right, there's a picture of a piece of linen that we actually found in the cellar this year. So.
That's amazing. Well, could we have the next slide? We'll talk more about the archaeology next week.
Sure. This is our museum. We have a great museum with about 1,000 artifacts on display that have been found at Jamestown, so you can go see where the archaeologists are working, and then you can walk right over to the museum and see some of these things on display. Some of them are a little beat up from being in the ground for 400 years, but it's a really neat exhibit.
Okay. Well, maybe we can put up our last slide while we say goodbye here so people can see some websites and things. And next week we'll talk with Kelsey Moore, who is my daughter and is the assistant curator at the lab at Jamestown Rediscovery and does really exciting work. And so next week we'll talk to her more about the actual archaeology and the 400th anniversary. We'll see you next week on Information Please. Public Library on the air, bring you information about your library and your community. And this evening is the second part of a two-part show. My guest is my daughter, Kelsey Noack, who is the assistant curator at the lab at the Jamestown Rediscovery Project in Jamestown, Virginia. Last week we talked about the history of Jamestown, and this week we're going to talk about the very exciting things that are going on there now with archaeology, the 400th anniversary, the visit of the Queen, lots of great stuff. Welcome back, Kelsey.
Hello.
Hi. You actually are an employee of the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities.
That's right. That's right.
Which is the APVA.
Yeah.
Is how people find that.
Mm-hmm.
But you are the assistant curator at the lab at Jamestown Rediscovery, which is what, basically?
Well, our project has been going since 1994. And we've got a great facility now put together with a sort of a team of people who all specialize in different things. And it was originally just supposed to be sort of a 10-year project to see what we could find, and it's turned into this huge thing that just keeps going. And we've got about 40% of the fort excavated now, and so every day we have materials coming in, going through the lab for curation and just lots and lots of stuff.
And if somebody goes to what's called the Historic Triangle area, because they're going to visit Williamsburg, and then they can go to Jamestown, which is the living history.
Jamestown Settlement.
Jamestown Settlement is a living history reconstruction of Jamestown, but then they go a little further down the road and they get to Jamestown Rediscovery, which is the real fort. You can see archaeologists at work in the field digging, plus you can go to a state-of-the-art museum called the Archeological.
Right.
Who invented that name?
I'm not sure.
It describes it, though, because it's archaeology, and it's almost is like an aquarium because the sides are all glass and you can see out. It's very fascinating.
Yeah, the name of it, arche means from the beginning or something that's really old. So we're looking at the beginning of Jamestown, and then arium is actually, I think it's either Latin or Greek, one of those, and it has to do with it's basically a place where you've got a reconstructed semi-natural environment. So what we're trying to do is show the archaeology in context. We're trying to show how the things would have been used originally, and then we're also demonstrating the context of what they look like in the ground. We've got several exhibits, like there's one of a well where we've got all the artifacts suspended in sort of a reconstructed well, so you can see a side view of what it would look like.
That's a really fascinating exhibit to see. Well, for those who didn't get to join us last week, let's go back, because a lot of people in this country just think Jamestown, Pocahontas, the Disney movie, and don't get it. So I don't want to go through what took us a half hour last week, but if you could give me a little short summary of the history of Jamestown, that'd be great.
Sure. So basically, the Virginia Company of London was established in England to make money, and so they sent 104 men and boys over in 3 ships, and they were a little late getting to Virginia, but they eventually made it in May of 1607. They built a fort. Didn't go very well for the first few years. They decided to leave, but on their way down the James River, they met Lord Delaware, and he told them to turn around, go back, start over, sort of revitalize the fort. Up until 1624, they continued to occupy that fort site, and then they really outgrew it, and so they expanded across the island and into the surrounding areas of Virginia with plantations and things. Government grew up there. They had the first representative democracy under the English there in Virginia. They built a state house where they had governmental meetings and kept records and things like that. It burned once in the 1670s during Bacon's Rebellion, and then it burned a second time in the 1690s, and that's when they decided to move the capital up to Williamsburg, which at that time was Middle Plantation. And so you've got about a good 90 years there where Jamestown was really the center of English activity. And John Smith and Pocahontas were just, a couple of the very important people during that period. You also had John Rolfe, who brought tobacco culture to Virginia, and all sorts of different people.
Many exciting characters and people we've heard of over the years, but somehow John Smith and Pocahontas were the ones we all learned about, I think, in grade school, and slightly warped versions of that, but
yes, romanticized stories.
Yeah, romanticized stories. People like that story. So, but there's much more at Jamestown, and you're finding more every day of what went on there. You've got some great images you've put together for us. So let's show the first one and kind of set the scene. Can you tell us what this is?
Right. So our project is the Jamestown Rediscovery Archaeological Project, and we are a part of the APVA. And you can see a map there of Virginia. That red arrow is pointing at where Jamestown Island is located. It's on the James River, which is the southernmost of those 4 tidal rivers on the east coast there. And down in the bottom corner, there's a map of Jamestown Island. There's a little section of the island on the left that's outlined in red, and that's our property. That's the APVA property. It's private. It's about 22 acres, and that just happens to be the location of the fort site, so lucky us. We didn't know it was there when it was purchased. The rest of the island is owned by the National Park Service. They bought it in the 1930s, and so we co-administer historic Jamestown with them, and then we are Jamestown Rediscovery. I've got portraits there of John Smith and Pocahontas again, so people know them the best out of anybody who was at Jamestown.
Okay, and if we could have our next image then. There it is.
So we've got a pretty large site open. We only have portions of it that we can work on at a time. About 40% of the site has been excavated so far, and so you can see that triangular shape on the map there. We've got the whole site broken up into 10 by 10 foot squares, and anything that's in white has been excavated already. Anything that's green has not yet been excavated. So we've got the 3 walls of the fort outlined there, the palisade walls, with a bulwark at each corner. Those are defensive positions.
And there's one that's in the river, and that was what led people to believe Jamestown was gone, correct?
Right. Because of the large channel there in the river, there's a lot of erosion, but we had a retaining wall put in 1900. And so that saved everything that was there, along with the Confederate fort that was built on top of the James Fort site in 1861. And so all of those red things that have been outlined there on the map, those are structures that we've identified. There's also a blue rectangle there, and sort of just above the center of the fort, and that's actually a building we've been working on this year, probably burned during Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s also.
And you find a lot of graves here too, don't you?
Right, yeah, the dark blue on the left there side of the map, those are all burials, probably from the starving time or from the earlier part, maybe the first winter that they were at Jamestown. And those are all English burials. So those are those first people that, you know, wouldn't have made it through the winter when they came over to Jamestown.
Okay, on the top left, what is that circular structure?
That is it's actually a structure that we built while excavating the well to sort of keep the dirt back. So that's, you know, the sort of thing you can see if you come to visit. We've got ongoing archaeology for most of the year. During the winter, the field crew does go inside to do some work in the lab with me. But if you go out there, you know, most of the year, any day of the week, you can see these things exposed. There's also another field picture there. That's actually me in the blue shirt in the top of the photo. And that's sort of the kind of things you'll see. You know, it's basically different colors of dirt in the ground. And so we have to go and try and make sense out of all that and then put it in the computer so we can create these nice maps. In the bottom right corner there is Dr. Bill Kelso, and he's the one who founded our project, essentially. In 1994 is when he began doing test excavations to look for the fort, because he was always told when he was younger and he would visit that it had all been washed away. And so the bottom right corner of the fort map there's a red rectangle, and that's actually the first structure that was found. He came right down on the foundations of that building, which is a barracks, so soldiers would have slept in there.
So he found that right off the bat.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Very lucky.
Yeah.
Archaeological lottery.
And people may recognize this photo if they've watched the special that was about the Queen. And he was in that show taking the Queen and Prince Philip on a tour of the Archaearium. People may have seen that. And
right.
He also has written books about Jamestown, and I think he's been on some other documentaries. I see him occasionally quoted places. So, but this is, you know, somebody with a vision, a dedicated person who persisted and found something fabulous that benefits all of us. So could we have our next image, please, and see some more of what's there? Here you've got artifacts.
Yeah, so once these things are excavated in the field, they come into the lab, and that's when I get to start working with them. And so we've got bags and bags of you know, dirty artifacts come in, and I have a small army of volunteers who I couldn't work without all my volunteers. They're very important to Jamestown. They help us wash things and get them sorted out. So we've got things like glass beads used for trade. That's what that red and blue thing in the top left corner of the screen is. Those are trade beads that would have been used as currency basically with the natives. We've also got a ring. It's a gold ring, and there's a skull on it, and it's a Memento Mori ring, which is basically it's Latin for remember death or remember your death. It was very popular then to have these things to remind you that, you know, life was short, and you know, just remember that you're mortal. And it's actually got the initials CL, which probably means that it belonged to Christopher Lawn. He was one of the early people at Jamestown. So we found that this summer. And then next to that, there's a picture of one of our conservators doing some work on a breastplate that was found. We have a lot of metal objects, a lot of iron specifically that comes out of the ground, and it looks kind of like fried chicken when we first get it. And so things are x-rayed, and then they go through a long process of electrolysis and air abrasion, which you see him doing there. It's basically a little wand that shoots out aluminum oxide powder. It's sort of like a little sandblaster. And so that removes a lot of the rust. In the bottom left, there's a picture, a table covered with a bunch of artifacts that have been conserved already. So there's helmet, breastplate, shovels, axes, all sorts of things like that. There's a pewter flagon that was found. In the center of the screen, there's a sword that was actually found with a group of armor and arms that were found when the Queen was visiting last year. And that piece is nearly done being conserved. It's going to be going to the Smithsonian here in a little bit for an exhibit that they're opening in February. It'll be up there for 2 years, called Written in Bone, and it's going to have lots of our materials on display incorporated into that exhibit. We've also got a piece of linen there on the right side of the screen that was found in a cellar that we excavated last year and the beginning of this year. And then that's me in the top part of the lab in that bottom photo with all the boxes. So that's sort of where I work every day, keeping things in order and processing artifacts for our curator. So.
Yeah, and there's a lot of nail polish and very tiny little pens involved in this work, because every single thing is numbered, and there's if you go there and visit and are lucky enough to see behind the scenes, which I get to, I have connections. There's drawers and drawers of things that are just fascinating to look at. And then you should mention too that in addition to Dr. Kelso, who's your, I guess, head archaeologist, then you have a curator. And that's
Blystraub. She does all of our research on the artifacts, and she's in charge of cataloging and sort of keeping everything, getting the information interpreted for all these pieces. And we've got something like 1.4 million pieces cataloged to date, and then continuing to have things ready for more cataloging every day, so lots and lots of neat stuff to look at.
Yeah, it just really has gone way beyond what anybody ever dreamed, hasn't it?
Right.
Because you basically had like almost 90 years worth of life buried under a Confederate fort, which then was not touched, so kind of like, the mother lode of archaeology, everything carefully preserved and just by accident, because they didn't look, because they thought it was gone.
Right.
So you didn't have the people with the metal detectors out there.
Right.
Because there were no Civil War battles, right? It was just built and then left.
Yeah, so the Confederate Army built their sort of like an earthwork structure with 8 or 9 feet of dirt, which was real good for preserving the James Fort site, and then the wooden platform on top of it. And so people were, walking around, but never, on anything to disturb the James Fort site.
It was all protected.
Right, and so we're a nonprofit, and through donations and lots of volunteers and stuff, we've created this site where we've got everything from the historical research to the excavation to the processing and curation of the materials, and then also display right there. So it's a really unique site because we've got so much stuff and so much going on all the time.
Yeah, very, very rich. And what's kind of sad is I think sometimes people go to Williamsburg and Jamestown settlement and they don't realize that the true prize is just down the road. So people get the opportunity to travel there. They want to make sure and leave plenty of time to see a really unique site there.
Right.
Well, I think we've got another image. Yep, here you go. This is all about your Archearium.
This is the Voorhees Archearium Museum. This opened in 2006 to get ready for the 400th anniversary last year in 2007. And it is a very cool building. It's actually a green building. It's got a copper exterior, and it's heated and cooled by geothermal wells, and so it's very, very neat. It's built on piers up above the State House foundation, so we could go back and do archaeology on the State House directly underneath if we ever wanted to. We've got about 1,000 artifacts on display, and so the Archearium, we're attempting to show these things in context, and so we've got some of the artifacts put up with drawings of where they would be in real life, armor that's mounted on a display panel in front of where it would be on a person, or these things being shown, how they would be in the ground. On the left there's a section of a mud and stud building that we had built inside the museum so that you could see what it would look like if you were to cut away parts of it. And we've also got these really cool virtual viewers, which you can see in the bottom left corner there, and one whole wall of the Archearium is glass, and so you can take these viewers, they're little cameras, and you can point them out at the landscape and pan across, and as you pan across areas where there would have been historic structures, it'll light up with a little cartoon of that building, and you can push a button and it'll tell you about the history of that structure, and it'll zoom in and you can see photos and videos of the excavation in progress.
That is really cool technology.
Yeah.
And then on the right, what are those fun jugs?
Those are Bartman Jugs, and Bartman means bearded man, and these were German stoneware drinking vessels. You would drink beer mostly out of these. People didn't drink a lot of water then because water wasn't such good quality, so you'd turn it into small beer, and you'd have these huge things to drink out of. And earlier on in the time that they were manufactured, they would have these little faces with a man with a beard, and he was usually smiling and pretty happy, and and then on the front would be sort of a medallion, a crest of either a town or of a family. And then over time, they were so popular, they started to change in shape a little, and they were more stylized, and people just started making sort of generic things on the front of them instead of an actual, crest. Sort of like going to Walmart and you buy a T-shirt that says "Go Tigers," but it's not actually any real team. It's a very popular item to have, and so we find really, I think, hundreds of these every year, hundreds of pieces of Bartman jugs. And that's just one type of ceramic out of hundreds of types of ceramics that we have there.
Okay. Let's show our next slide, which is where people can get more information, I think. That's our next slide. That gives the addresses, yeah.
Yeah, so historicjamestown.org will take you to the front page for the park that we co-administer with the Park Service, and you can get information on ticket prices and things there. If you're specifically interested in the Jamestown Rediscovery project and you want to look at the archaeology, we do have monthly updates during the field season, so you can go on there and see some really good quality photos of things that we're finding and pictures of the field. And also the APVA has lots of historic properties all over the state of Virginia. If you're interested, if you're coming out for vacation, you like to see more than Jamestown, you can find all that information on our website there.
Yeah, they're good websites, and it's fun to see, where are we digging, what are we finding,
right.
And kind of fun to keep going back and looking and see the newest things. But tell me about the 400th anniversary, and I know an awful lot of work was done to get ready for that, and tell me about the visit of the Queen. There's a lot of people who are celebrity followers would love to touch you because you saw the Queen. It's like I've been to Jamestown to see the Queen.
I did. Actually, the whole project was in preparation for the 400th anniversary, because the idea was Dr. Kelsey was, let me go look, let me see if I can find something, and that'll give me a good 10 years to get ready to present something for the 400th anniversary. The Queen had been to Jamestown for the 350th anniversary in 1957. She brought us this big wooden crest that hangs in the reconstructed church now. So she was invited. President Bush was also invited, and our governor, Governor Tim Kaine, and Dick Cheney was there. Most of them were all at different times. We couldn't have all of them at once with all the security. But so this project, we sort of were, 2007 is coming, and we're still digging, and we're still finding more stuff. And so they just kept going with the project, and we've got our new lab facility now, and so we really were rolling with the excavation and stuff. And so then the Archearium was built so that we could have display space right there on the island. And it was opened in 2006 to make sure it was all ready for the Queen by the next year. And so she came, she went to Jamestown Settlement first and saw a presentation there, and then she came over to see the real site. And she and Philip were there, and they had their motorcade, all their big black SUVs with the lights going on them, and we had to wait for quite a long time in the visitor center so that they could, do a security sweep of the whole island, and then the metal detectors, and we got these little cards with a color and a number, and we had to go to the corresponding color area behind these ropes. And so then she pulls up, and it's been raining for a few days, so I was actually wearing rubber boots and I had an umbrella, and she got out of the car and met with the director of the APVA and our curator Bly, who was actually also English, so that was exciting for her. And lots of children giving her flowers and things like that. And she got a private tour of the Archearium with Bly, and Philip went to go look at the vault and look at the lab areas with Dr. Kelso. And then actually he came back out and was walking down the road, and I was taking pictures of him, and I looked down at my camera to see if I had a good picture, and my friend was nudging me, and so I looked up, and he was standing right in front of me talking to me, and he asked me if I was a digger. Which I've also found out is slang for an Australian, so...
You're not sure what he meant. You're either Australian or an archaeologist.
Right, so I told him I was, and was a grad student in archaeology, and that I worked there at Jamestown, and so he was in a very good mood, despite the rainy weather. And the Queen continued on into the archaeological site and was walking around, climbing down into the excavation areas, and wanted to see everything up close. And there's a nice photo of her somewhere peeking into a well with Dr. Kelso, and she presented us with a chair she had commissioned that was made out of wood from England and Virginia, and she designed it, and it had all sorts of crests and things in it. And
nice.
It's at the Governor's in Virginia.
At the Governor's.
Yeah, we did have it for a little while on
So
display.
do you think the royal couple enjoyed their tour and were
Actually,
impressed?
yeah, they were very excited. They ran over on their tour. They were running late. They had, of course, other appointments after us, and they took too long, but we've got this giant photo in a frame that they signed for us, and we also got a thank you letter from one of her ladies-in-waiting last year because we sent them a Christmas card from our project. So that's hanging up in our copy room.
How nice, how nice.
Yeah.
So, but you have many famous people that come through and visit, and so you're in kind of a hot spot for American culture there. But tell me, for you personally, what it has been like to be there and handle these things. And
it's really exciting, and I mean it's kind of sad because there's some days where I start to feel like it's a little mundane. It's like, oh, more pipes, more ceramics, more bone fragments from food remains. Somebody's chewing on a chicken leg and then they throw it out. But then it's really exciting and rewarding for me when there are people coming through. We've got VIPs, but also school groups or teachers or all sorts of special groups of people come through, and you show them, well, this is what I work on, and to me it's just sort of an everyday thing, and people are always so excited when they get to come in the lab, and that's really great because then it gets me excited about what I do again. And it's exciting, and there's so much going on all the time.
What do you think is your favorite artifact that you've ever seen?
Well, I mean, the gold ring was pretty exciting when that was found. Personally, I mean, when I was out in the field before, and I found a pipe stem that was made by Robert Cotton circa 1610, and we know that very specific fact about it because it has a very particular look to it. There's he would make it out of the local Virginia clay, and it would usually have a faceted surface to the pipe stem, and then he would stamp it with these little inlays as these little fleur-de-lis and diamonds. And so picked this up out of the ground, and I was so excited, and I showed it to people, and they said, oh yeah, that's Robert Cotton, 1610. And so, I mean, we have so much information, things like that. Also, I specialize in faunal analysis, so I look at animal bones left over from food, and we've found cahao bones, which the cahao is a Bermuda petrel, and when they wrecked on Bermuda, they actually ate a lot of those, and they became such an important food source that they were thought to be extinct for a long time. They rediscovered a colony of them on Bermuda in the 1950s, but we've got this little bone there at Jamestown, little tiny bone. So ended up at Jamestown, and we know what it is. So.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Kelsey, for sharing your experiences and bringing us all these neat photos and everything of what's going on at Jamestown. And we'll miss you. Your family will miss you. And Peoria will miss you after this, too.
Come on out anytime.
Yeah, come on out and visit. And if you go to get a chance to go to Jamestown, be sure and go and ask for Kelsey and tell her you're from Peoria. We've got a lot going on. You can come and find out all kinds of research and history on Jamestown, Williamsburg, any of these things if you're planning a trip or you just want to know. This has been a 2-part series, and you can find out everything you want just by visiting the websites that are on there. If you've forgotten them, give us a call at the library. We'll see you next week at Information Please.